ඔවුන්ගේ අනාගතයේ කොටසක් වන්නට ඉඩ නොදෙන්න. ඔබ මුහුදු වෙරළට යන සෑම අවස්ථාවකම වෙරළ පිරිසිදු කිරීමට පුංචි මිනිත්තුවක් වැය කරන්න. ප්ලාස්ටික් සයිකල් වෙතින් පණිවිඩයක්.
In 2019, Kiehl's pledged to reduce 50% of its single-use polythene usage in stores by 2025. So far, on a monthly basis, we inspired 38,000 shoppers to switch to reusable bags and around 108 shoppers to bring their own containers for shopping. We replaced 132,000 plastic straws with paper straws while continuing to look for a sustainable solution for juice cups. Our top crust bread bags were replaced with compostable bags, reducing over 20,000 single-use polythene bags a day. Our fish, meat, fruit and vegetable counters also switched to compostable bags. That's not all. We continued to build awareness among our staff on the importance of reducing polythene usage and walk the journey towards reducing our impact on the environment, because together we can.
Conserving blue carbon ecosystems like seagrass, mangroves and marshlands is important because they store 3 times more carbon than forest and land ecosystems. They also provide jobs and income to local economies, improve water quality, support healthy fisheries and provide coastal protection. However, it is estimated that half of the global mangrove cover has disappeared in the last 40 years. Did you know Sri Lanka was designated as the global mangrove champion under the Commonwealth Blue Charter? Over the next decade, Dilma Conservation will commit to restore and conserve over 24 acres of degraded mangrove forest in Sri Lanka. We are collaborating with governmental organizations, local communities, educational institutes and other corporates. We aim to create a replicable model which will restore mangrove and shallow marine ecosystems with socio-economic development by the year 2030. Mangroves are a unique ecosystem, a special ecosystem, and a vulnerable ecosystem. But we can protect the mangroves together.
Blue Resources Trust is a Sri Lankan NGO. We started work in 2016. Primary areas of focus are coral reef conservation and elasmobranch fisheries. We also help the government with policy work and MPA management. So since we started our fisheries project, we have surveyed nearly 20 harbours and landing sites all across the country. What we've done for the last 3 years is focus more on data collection from the lesser known and smaller landing sites because very little to no data exists from these sites. When we go to the fish market, we take photos to know what species are being landed. We take measurements of those specimens that are landed. We also take DNA samples from the specimens at the fish markets. Since August of 2017, we've documented 13,000 specimens consisting of 40 species of rays and 43 species of sharks. From these specimens, we have collected over 3,000 DNA samples. The reason we study sharks and rays is because these animals are very vulnerable to overfishing. Unlike other fish, their life cycle and life histories resemble land animals like elephants and leopards more than fish like tuna. Most sharks and rays live for a long time. They have very few young. They reproduce only once every few years. All of this makes them very vulnerable to overfishing. There are many different fishing methods used in Sri Lanka depending on the size of the boat and the weather. While there are a few targeted shark and ray fisheries, most of them are bycatch in the long line and the gillnet fisheries of Sri Lanka. Although shark and ray meat is consumed in Sri Lanka, it's not very valuable. The biggest value from the shark and ray fishery comes from the export of the shark fins and the gill plates of mobulas. These species are apex predators, and protecting them is vital to maintaining a healthy ecosystem. In the end, all fisheries rely on a healthy ecosystem in the ocean.
The ocean. Our island is surrounded by it. We live in the midst of it. Mesmerizing. Enthralling. Pleasing. Our ocean is unique, a vibrant marine habitat. We have loyal whales who never leave our seas. Turtles who always return to our shorelines. Mangroves sequestering carbon. Dugongs gliding beneath the waves. Seagrass meadows pumping oxygen we breathe. Underwater reefs sheltering marine life. But they're struggling. Coral reefs bleached. Our seabeds scraped over by foreign fishing trawlers. We're depleting our marine life through overfishing. Plastic and chemical waste pollution gush into our oceans. Coastal sand is disappearing. Marine animals killed by dynamite. Turtles entangling in goose nets. Ships colliding with whales. Climate change. Global warming. Oil spills. Coastal construction. Ocean acidification. Ocean's life is draining. We need the ocean. Our survival depends on it. The sea around us is now a hotspot for geopolitics, trade, security, maritime ventures, and crime. Our impact on the ocean matters. Our ocean is our lungs, our hearts, our nerves. Without it, no one can survive. We can only thrive if our oceans survive. Let's strive to be the guardians of the ocean. Let us be the protectors together for our ocean.
Welcome everyone and good evening. My name is John Wilson. I am a wildlife conservationist and protected area specialist as well as an executive committee member at Rainforest Protectors of Sri Lanka. I would like to welcome you all to the World Oceans Day Summit 2021, where today's session is on marine conservation and marine protected area expansion under the theme of Sri Lanka's ocean biodiversity. Symbolically, I would also like to wish all of our viewers who are tuning in today a very happy World Environment Day 2021. The World Oceans Day Summit is hosted by the Pearl Protectors in partnership with the Marine Environment Protection Authority, the Blue Resources Trust, and the World Oceans Day Organization. The World Oceans Day Summit intends to delve into all aspects of the ocean around Sri Lanka, while highlighting key challenges and opportunities and simultaneously inspiring Sri Lankans to love and care for our marine environment. You can learn more about the summit on pearlprotector.org. The purpose of the session today is to highlight how the declaration, demarcation, and gazetting of marine protected areas, or as they're more commonly known, MPAs, contributes to the preservation and sustainable utilization of the marine environment through properly oriented legislation and regulations which govern how different marine protected areas are managed. The recent maritime tragedy off the coastlines of the Western Province has added a new set of negative variables to the management and utilization of marine protected areas, and will be briefly explored towards the conclusion of today's session. We are fortunate to have two expert panelists to discuss today's topics. I would first like to introduce Mr. Manjula Amararathna, one of the Deputy Director Generals at the Department of Wildlife Conservation, who is Director, Protected Area Management. Mr. Amararathna, thank you very much for joining us today. I would also like to introduce Mr. Nishan Perera, who is the co-founder and director at the Blue Resources Trust. I would additionally, and thank you for joining us today, Nishan. I would additionally like to request that members of the audience send us any questions you may have. We will try to answer them with an interesting to the comments section on either Facebook or YouTube, depending on which of the two platforms you're on. So, in the spirit of commencement, I would like to start with Nishan. Nishan, what are the MPAs of Sri Lanka and how useful are they in marine conservation?
Well, thanks, Sean. So MPAs, or marine protected areas, basically are a tool used in marine conservation that allows us to kind of focus conservation efforts or management efforts into a specific geographic area. Primarily because if you look at an ocean environment, it's such a vast spatial scale that managing these areas, whether it's fishery management or strict conservation, is very difficult. And no country has those resources. So MPAs allow you to focus management effort into an area, and these areas are usually chosen because they are either critical habitats or contain certain important species or are important fishery areas. So that's how you kind of use MPAs as a conservation tool. And marine protected areas can be a variety of things. It could be natural habitats like open oceans, coral reefs, wetlands. That is what we traditionally think of as marine protected areas. But they could also be culturally significant sites or man-made sites like shipwrecks, coastal structures of archaeological or cultural value like lighthouses, around which there's some kind of conservation or preservation and in some kind of management, basically a tool to manage how humans use that area and the resources therein. So that's basically how you use them as a tool in resource management and conservation.
Thank you, Nishan. Thank you for that very elaborate and much needed introduction. If I was to move on to Mr. Manjula Amararathna. Mr. Amararathna, what are the categories of marine protected areas currently available in Sri Lanka as per the Department of Wildlife Conservation? Mr. Amararathna, you're on mute at the moment. So we seem to be having a little bit of a technical difficulty. Mr. Amararathna, can you hear us? Can you hear us, Mr. Amararathna?
Yeah. Department of Wildlife Conservation, we are declaring a protected area, so marine or terrestrial, under the provisions of fauna. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me now? No.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you. I think there's a bit of a delay.
Yeah, we can hear you. Hello. I can hear. Hello. Okay, right. Now I am talking about the actually fauna and flora protection ordinance. It's given the legal background. Yeah, legal. Okay, right. Legal provisions for declaring terrestrial and as well as marine protected areas. When we consider about terrestrial protected areas, we have declared under several categories, under several criteria, and strict natural reserves, national park, uh, nature reserves, and sanctuaries and jungle corridors. But in Sri Lanka, when we considering marine protected areas, we have only three categories: national parks, nature reserves, and marine sanctuaries. And so far, we have declared more than 20 marine protected areas, including 5 national parks, 3 nature reserves, and also others are sanctuaries.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Amra. So then I guess...
And
yeah, go ahead.
Then for the example, marine national parks, we all know the very famous coral Hikkadu coral reef we have declared as marine national park, and also in Trincomalee area, Pigeon Island National Park, and Adams Creek National Park. When we consider about national reserves, Veditaletu and other areas we have declared.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Amra.
And actually, we have declared so many marine sanctuaries, Bar Reef in Kalpitia, and very recently we have declared Kayankani, Great Bassas, Little Bassas, and so many marine sanctuaries we have declared under the provisions of the fauna and protected.
All right. So thank you for that, Mr. Amararathna. A very, very much needed piece of clarity regarding the marine protected areas that we have in Sri Lanka. So then if I move back to Nishan. Nishan, can you maybe just tell us, since Mr. Amararathna has spoken about the marine protected areas under the Department of Wildlife Conservation, we also know that there are marine protected areas available under the Department of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources. So to the best of your knowledge, what are the criteria for declaring these MPAs under fisheries?
Yes, so under the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act, there is provision to declare fishery managed areas of fishery reserves. Now, these don't, let's say, qualify or fit the traditional concept of marine protected areas, which is what we do under the FFPO. But they are basically areas in which you can manage fisheries. You bring management restrictions on fisheries, and they technically qualify as MPAs under the IUCN criteria or categories of MPA. So some level of management of resource extraction or human activity. The main reason behind this is to, again, going back to that, what I said earlier, to manage human activities in a spatial scale or in a given geographic area. So these could be gear-based restrictions on what type of fishing methods. It could be temporal, time-based closures of or seasonal closure of fishing. It could be spatial closure of certain activities, like prohibiting certain activities in certain areas of the ocean. So they fulfill essentially the same conservation objectives, but they allow more human resource extraction or use within that, whereas under the FFPO you normally don't allow resource extraction. The criteria again for all of these, for all of them, I think, is basically to conserve critical habitats. These could be sensitive ecosystems like coral reefs, seagrass beds. It's to conserve important areas that are, say, breeding grounds, nursery grounds, migration pathways. Now we've identified areas that dugongs use, that are seagrass patches that the department is working to conserve. Coral reefs have been a focal ecosystem. I know the department is working hard to kind of develop MPAs to regulate whale watching, so marine mammals. So it could be around a species, it could be around an ecosystem, but increasingly we are focusing more on an ecosystem approach, because it's the more effective way of conserving these species.
Okay, thank you, Nishan. Just to, I guess, move on to that, since that point nicely links up. What provisions are there to protect threatened species? Because to the best of my knowledge, both the FFPO and the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act both protect a number of marine species. So what are the provisions, to the best of your knowledge, under the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act? And are these effective ways of conserving them both with and without marine protected areas? Based, I mean, just on your expertise.
Well, there are several species that are listed under the FFPO and under the Fisheries Act as protected species. So you cannot basically catch them, like certain fish species, of course, turtles, marine mammals that you cannot catch. The challenge with marine conservation is very few of these. Now, we have historically had people hunting turtles and dolphins and stuff, but generally, many of these species are not directly targeted. But they're caught in larger fisheries activities. So some are bycatch, so that is the accidental capture of species. So small marine mammals like dolphins and then sea turtles and non-target fish species are often caught in commercial fisheries. So the challenge is that no one might be trying to kill a turtle, but the turtles are getting entangled in nets in that area. So that is why taking an ecosystem approach and declaring spatial areas or geographic areas as protected areas where you can manage those human activities is more effective. So once you declare an MPA, if you have effective management and you restrict certain fishing activities, then you will prevent those animals even being accidentally caught. And also at the same time, we will protect critical habitats, because sometimes fisheries can also damage habitats by things like bottom set nets or trawling or other methods of fishing. So therefore, because of the nature of how these species are affected, it's more effective to have marine protected areas. And the other thing is because of the openness of the ocean, things move around, so there's exchange between areas. So you can have benefits of a marine protected area or fish stocks spilling out of that area and benefiting fish catchers in the long term as well.
Thank you, Nishan. So that's a good elaboration, actually, on how fisheries seems to have its own set of potential regulations that could be utilized, especially when looking at an ecosystems approach, which I'm gathering is very, very important, especially where marine protected areas under the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act are concerned. So then if we move back to Mr. Amararathna, Mr. Amararathna, as per your capacity as Director Protected Area Management, what provisions exist in the Flora and Fauna Protection Ordinance to protect threatened marine species?
Have to unmute it.
Hello, Mr. Wilson. Your voices are not clear to me. Maybe pardon, please.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
I think just repeat the question, John.
Yeah, sure. So, Mr. Amararathna, basically repeating the question. So, what provisions exist under the Flora and Fauna Protection Ordinance at the moment to protect threatened marine species, based on your directorship, or based on your position as a director protected area?
Hello, can you hear me? Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, Mr. Wilson, your voice. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, yeah, yeah. Yes. As Nishan mentioned, that ecosystem approach also we followed. That basically we think.
Oh, I think we lost Mr. Amararathna. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, I guess we'll move on until he comes back. I think Mr. Amararathna is having connection issues, unfortunately. So anyway, we'll keep the session going until he rejoins. So, Nishan, what is the actual status of MPAs, to the best of your knowledge at the moment? Because there's a lot of criticism at the moment where MPAs are potentially suggested as not the best solution available, and some people say they actually cause more problems than solutions. There are new papers being recorded out there which are saying MPAs based on the climatic distribution and movement of species are just impractical. So what is the status of MPAs in the moment, and how do you rate it based on your professional experience?
Well, I think there's two questions there. One is, are MPAs effective? Certainly not perfect. They are not without their flaws, but I don't think there is any solution that we have available that is a perfect solution. And currently, they have been proven to be one of the more effective methods of conservation. They may not be applicable in every case, but on a general sense, they are fairly effective. There are more complications with more migratory species and in large ocean areas. But when it comes to conserving coastal ecosystems, some of the critical ecosystems, there are demonstrated results of successful MPAs. If you were to look at MPAs in Sri Lanka, now that's a different question. I think if we are all being honest, and if Mr. Amararathna was here, I think he would have also agree with me that they have not been successful overall. Now, we have isolated examples to show that some things are working in some areas, but if you were taking it in a general sense, they have not been effective. But that is primarily for issues with management. Our management of our MPAs has not been effective. Now, there are many reasons for this. It's not just due to the fault of one organization or situation. It's a multifaceted problem. The Wildlife Department does face many challenges in managing these MPAs. Because we work with them quite closely, I understand some of their challenges. But they're not effective. And while we have been effective at declaring, we heard earlier about, I think, around 20 MPAs being there in Sri Lanka. Most of them do tend to function as paper park. Beyond the gazetting or designation, there's no actual implementation. So, for example, fishing, which should not happen, happens. Dynamite fishing is happening inside the MPA. Boats are still anchoring. So the human pressures or human activities that we are trying to reduce have not reduced. In some cases, places like the Bar Reef Marine Sanctuary, which was declared in 1992, overall human activity like fishing has increased since it was declared. Probably tenfold, not twofold. It's increased tenfold since its declaration. So it has remained as a declaration without effective management. So in that sense, yeah, they're not effective. But when done well, they are quite an effective tool.
Okay. So if we take that further while we wait for Mr. Amararathna to rejoin us, how would you address that criticism specifically, that criticism that these marine protected areas simply appear to be nothing more than paper documentation and just gazettes that are floating around? And how would you, I mean, based on your, again, this is based on your experience, how has working with the marine subunit elaborated as to what really is happening with the management of MPAs? Are they able to achieve their goals, or is it a bit more impractical due to the limited resources?
Limited resources are a challenge, but I think one of the things we need to do moving forwards is to get out of this situation of just saying we have limited resources, because the challenges that Sri Lanka faces are common to many developing countries. And there are successful MPAs in countries like Philippines, Indonesia, Tanzania, Kenya, which have lower GDP, lower literacy, higher poverty rates, and all of that. So we need to look at how they achieve that and look at more innovative solutions. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that marine conservation as a whole is relatively young in Sri Lanka. There has been work, but in terms of MPAs and stuff, it's most of these MPAs that we heard of have been declared over the last 10 years, many in the last 5 years. So the concept is new in Sri Lanka, and one of the challenges has been to shift from a terrestrial protected area mentality into marine protected areas, because you have different challenges which require different solutions. So that's taking some time, and we need to also be more proactive when we are declaring in understanding what our conservation objectives are. This is something I always stress, because I know it's very easy to say that we are declaring an area to conserve this critical coral reef or something. But what I mean by conservation objectives is you have to understand certain criteria you want to meet, certain conservation targets, like you want an increase in coral cover or increase in certain fish populations or a reduction in certain destructive activities. And then you design your management activities with those targets in mind, and you evaluate those management effectiveness, and you adapt. So what I call adaptive management, because otherwise what happens is we continue to use the same solution and expect different results. So this is not, it's easier said than done. Talking here together with you is much easier than going and doing it, because there are multiple challenges. Mr. Amararathna would be able to elaborate on some of those challenges, but as a scientist, I can tell you some of these approaches and solutions, but of course enforcing it, but identifying those targets and having that clearly in mind and being practical with those expectations and management measures is important at the stage of declaration, because what happens is otherwise you declare the MPA without a clear plan of how you're going to manage it, and then you have challenges. But that's where. But there are opportunities, and we need to be innovative. We need to think out of the box, out of traditional conservation, to find innovative solutions.
Thank you, Nishan. We'll get back to that point about scientific and research components, because I think that's very crucial going forward with the actual achieving of the targets that you mentioned for marine protected areas. Mr. Amararathna, you are back with us. I hope you can hear us. Can you hear us now? Is the connection better on your end?
I can hear, but it's not. Your voice is not clear, Wilson. I think I'm having internet. Yeah, my connection is.
He's Mr. Amarathna is unfortunately having connection issues. I apologize again, but it seems that there isn't much about that. Anyway, Nishan, so I guess that's a point we can now address now because, as I mentioned earlier, this and more importantly, as you said, the achievement of these targets is very, very much needed. So, as a researcher, do you see significant data gaps or component areas that need to be improved for science-based management with regard to MPAs in Sri Lanka, based on your work?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's unfortunate that we lost Mr. Amararathna because I think it's really interesting to hear their side of the story as well. I think he might come on again. But yeah, in research gaps, there certainly are. And this is, again, a constraint. So what I talked about earlier of setting conservation targets also requires good data. We need to know what's happening. And one of the biggest challenges with Sri Lanka, or problems here, is that we lack long-term data. So we tend to have kind of research and management tends to take a project approach. So we have a lot of sporadic surveys, but no continuous data for an ecosystem. Not no, but very little, very few places have that. And you need that to understand long-term trends, because we have a lot of baseline data, but baseline data is of no use until you have monitoring data to follow up, to look at how things are changing over time. That helps you to understand ecological processes, things like ecosystem connectivity, how certain species use different habitats across their life cycle or different times of the year. Where are, for example, as a coral reef ecologist, where is the coral larvae coming from? Are we protecting those larval sources? Because, for example, when we go to a coral reef and see a beautiful coral reef, all the larvae to replenish the reef may not come from there. It might be coming from a less attractive reef that we are not protecting. So that's important. With climate change, we've had coral bleaching and mortality. We need to identify some of the resilient reefs, the reefs that are coping better, maybe because of the species composition or other oceanographic conditions. We need to identify them and protect those. Sometimes what we think is required to be protected because we see something as an interesting or exciting ecosystem, it looks pretty, may not be the highest priority because the ecological services can be different. So this kind of data is required, but again, it takes time and effort. But having, again, understanding what our research needs are at the start is critical, because otherwise researchers are also doing their own things. Whereas if we have a national priority identified, working together with the Department of Wildlife, then all researchers can kind of support that. And we have to have a good method to collate that data and then make sure that that data is used for management. Because even the data we have in Sri Lanka, with all its shortcomings, is still, there's a problem with all of it not getting used for management sometimes because data is sitting all over the place. So we need to have a more cohesive, coordinated effort for that.
Okay, so there are scientific gaps that do need to be addressed clearly. But at the same time, there is this, this usual argument by a lot of local communities that based on the fact that their livelihoods are sustained from the ocean and that there's such a big disconnect between the scientific community and local communities who depend on oceans, they might still argue that MPAs adversely affect local fisheries and the economic activities of these communities and maybe even potentially deny them their fishing rights. So how would you respond to that if that accusation was thrown your way?
So if you were to take traditional MPAs where you have no-take areas, certainly in the short term, there will be impacts. Obviously, if you declare a no-take MPA where you cannot fish or access, then you're depriving certain communities of access to fishing rights. I would then say counter that and say that on the long term, that does support sustainability. And the idea here is not to block off the entire ocean, but to cover certain small areas. If you take Sri Lanka's ocean area, the MPA coverage of all MPAs existing is less than 1%. It's less than 0.5% of our ocean area. So we've basically left 99.5% accessible for people to fish and extract resources. So that argument doesn't really hold stead that we are depriving so much. However, there's also the thing that there's what I mentioned earlier of spillover. So you might preserve a certain critical habitat, which is a fish breeding ground, and this is again demonstrated in other countries, overall the fish catchers outside the protected area can increase if you have a very well managed MPA, because when the fish are breeding inside, they don't just stay in the boundaries that we draw on maps, they leave outside. So then they're caught by fishermen and they have better catches. The other thing is that all MPAs do not have to be no-take areas. Like I said, fishery managed areas. Also within the DWC provisions for sanctuaries, you can allow certain types of traditional resource use. Traditional fisheries can be permitted with certain guidelines. And it's important to involve local communities in these things and empower them to be part of the management process. I certainly agree that scientists or managers going to a site and declaring something as an MPA without working with those communities and excluding them is not a good approach. And that alienates the communities. You need to build support with them. And I think when you work with them, eventually most communities do understand and do support conservation, but you have to find compromises like anything else.
Okay, so there has to be a balance ultimately, because I guess if there isn't a balance on one side, you're going to have local communities who will continue to shout and say that, look, our rights are actually being trampled upon. But on the other side, you do have enough provisions for marine protected areas that you can declare some that are no-take zones, but then you can find a balance and say, look, these are also zones which you can actually engage in sustainable fishery. So I think that is, yes, a very important compromise. Mr. Amararathna, I see you're back with us. I'm sorry that you had those connection issues. Can you hear us now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Mr. Amararathna. It's really nice to have you back. So just going back to the question of provisions. So we do appear to have provisions under the Flora and Fauna Protection Ordinance to protect threatened species in Sri Lanka. What are those provisions, and are they effective at protecting marine species, to the best of your professional knowledge?
Actually, under fauna and flora protection ordinance, we have enough provisions to protect protected species. Especially, we know all the turtle species are protected. All the marine mammals are protected. I think we the legal provisions of the fauna and flora protection ordinance enough space for protection all species. But problem is that implementing such legal provisions, we are facing some issues. When we take in the department side, actually we face, we work terrestrial activities, especially human-elephant conflict and other. We did management in terrestrial areas. But recently, we established a marine unit in our department, and now we are training our people, and we are acquiring equipment. We are purchasing boats and other things. I think in future we can implement our activities in the marine areas efficiently in future. We hope. I think now we are enter into this marine activities, and in future we can do it in very efficient way.
Okay, so can you just give us some examples, Mr. Amararathna, of existing marine protected areas in Sri Lanka, which are directly under the DWC? Just a few examples.
Yeah, actually, as I mentioned earlier, coral reefs we declared Kadu National Park and General National Park in Trincomalee. Then recently we declared Edelsby National Park, linking India and Sri Lanka. It's a very important bird migratory route, and also the changeable sandbars, which have been very important biodiversity, good bird habitat, and the marine area, very good habitat for the various marine species, dugongs and other marine mammals also. And in future, we are going to actually we have identified several marine national areas.
Okay.
And when we consider sanctuaries, the biggest marine sanctuary is the Bari in Kalpitia, mainly conservation of coral reefs. And in southern coast, we declared Godawaya and Rakava, especially for protecting turtle nesting habitats, nesting sites. And Miris area, when we consider about the whale washing activities, uh, in future we are planning to declare those area also as marine sanctuary because of the uh, as an important whale habitat.
Okay, so I guess leading on from that, Mr. Amararathna, what do you think are the challenges to effectively manage protected areas under the DWC? Are the challenges, are they manpower, are they funding, are they technical expertise? What are these challenges when it comes to marine protected area management for the DWC?
Yeah, actually, as I mentioned, we are facing more challenges because of we recently entered to the marine activities.
Yeah.
Actually, we don't have much trained officers in marine activities. Now we are train our people for swimming, diving, snorkeling, and identification of marine species. That kind of training we are providing to our officers. And actually, as I mentioned, the marine unit very recently established, I think 2016, about 5 years back. I think now we are acquiring some equipments and vessels. Recently, we purchased wave rider vessel to a Marissa area and boats and other important equipments. I think those are the challenges we are facing uh, for marine area.
Okay, so if we take a specific example, now we saw that Vedithilathipu, the newest
Yeah.
marine nature reserve, was in the news quite a
Yes.
bit, actually. And I think I'll get Nishan's point of view as well after we get Mr. Amararathna. So we heard that there were many attempts to de-gazette Vedithilathipu, especially
Yeah.
for aquaculture projects.
Yeah.
So what is your position on this? And does this not go against the objective of an MPA existing? What's your opinion on this, Mr. Amararathna?
Yeah. As a government officer, I can't give my personal opinion here.
Of course, of course.
But actually, when we de-gazette in the wildlife protected area, this is a procedure in our
Okay.
fauna flora protection ordinance. First, we should conduct environment sensitive assessment before de-gazetting the area. Actually, we have conducted that assessment, and it revealed the de-gazetting of that area is not advisable.
Okay.
Actually, we inform it, and it's our the department voices. The we cannot de-gazette that area because of the biological importance.
Understood. Nishan, do you potentially have an alternative viewpoint on the whole Vedithilathipu controversy? How would you approach it?
Not exactly. I think this is a constant challenge. We have interdepartmental or interministerial conflicts like this because you have different ministries with different mandates to do different things, and it's not, if you take it from each organization side, they have a mandate to do something. So sometimes the NACTA or the aquaculture organizations are mandated or pushed under pressure to expand aquaculture. There's development pressures. So they're following their mandate, and then the Department of Wildlife has a mandate to conserve. So this can be a conflict. And Vedithilathipu is a perfect example of that. There was, I know Mr. Manjula is also aware, when we declared Kayan Kearney Marine Sanctuary, also there was, before the declaration, some push to not declare it because there was interest for aquaculture and all of that. But then the department managed to overcome those challenges and declare it. So the department itself, when I mean department, the wildlife department is committed to conserving. And as you heard, there is a process, and they followed the process, and they conducted the studies, and the recommendation was not to de-gazette. So that is not coming from within the Department of Wildlife, the push to de-gazette. It's coming from other ministries and departments. And then, of course, there are procedures to follow. Once that comes from a, government department, there are procedures to follow, and they were followed. So I think at least it's an example that the procedures exist and were followed, which is in a way a win for conservation, despite the challenges that were faced. we were able to overcome them because of existing structures. But we will continue to have this because as the country develops, as human population grows and the economy grows, there's going to be pressures, and it's always going to be a tug of war of finding the right balance between conservation and development and resource use.
Okay, so a couple of interesting viewpoints. As we all know, became a very, very contentious area. But going back to, I guess, what we talked about earlier, Nishan, we mentioned community participation. Mr. Amararathna, since community participation and support is critical for the success of actually managing and utilizing MPAs, does the DWC involve local communities in the management of MPAs? And if so, how does that work, Mr. Amararathna?
Yeah, actually, community involvement in conservation is very vital. For the example, in Kalpitia Barif Sanctuary, we get much community participation for conservation activities. Because awareness is most important thing. We should aware people the importance of the area and importance of people. What is the importance? What are the benefits to the people when we conserve in that kind of ecosystem? Then actually in other areas also we aware people, then they voluntarily coming to conserve that area. Very good example is Kalpiti. In other areas also, actually they are having benefits from conservation, the tourism activities, and also the fish and prawns, and the harvest will be increased if we conserve that area. For example, if we conserve in the vegetative area, we are conserving the mangroves and other mangroves and seagrass beds. It's directly support to increase their fish harvest or prawns harvest or crabs harvest. I think if we aware them, then they voluntarily support us to conserve it.
Thank you, Mr. Amararathna. So there is clearly a strong element of community participation that is needed. Before we move on, Nishan, do you have any thoughts on this? Just briefly.
No, I think Mr. Amararathna touched on some of the aspects I mentioned earlier as well, and I think he mentioned something that I didn't earlier, which is very important, of those other benefits, because we always talk of the existing traditional use, which is the resource use, and I talked about potential increase in catches by conserving, but these indirect benefits like non-extractive uses like tourism. So, balances are found in many different ways. Yes, of course, sometimes you might not be able to continue some of your fishing activities the way you used to, but many of these people have transitioned to taking on other activities. Many of the people who conduct whale watching or snorkeling operations now used to be fishers and have sometimes better income and better livelihoods with the new scenario. Unfortunately, this current pandemic and the tourism situation has not helped it, so it's a bit of a problem. But these are things that will resort itself out over time. But definitely, people can benefit, and that's indirect. People have started homestays and other things. So there's many benefits for a community to get. And when you look at the value of an MPA, those are all the ecosystem services that you generate, of the value that it generates for that thing. And a very interesting thing was in the Maldives, when they actually, around 2010, they banned shark fishing. And at that time, they kind of valued the sharks, and the value of a shark when it was caught dead and used for meat versus for tourism, divers coming to see the shark was, something like 30-40% times higher, because you have recurring use of divers from around the world coming to benefit from this. So there are definite economic benefits, and it's important that we showcase that and make sure those benefits trickle down to the community. That is important, so that they feel the benefits, then they will support conservation, as you have seen even in Sri Lanka, as some of the examples that were mentioned earlier.
Okay, so let's touch on that, since the next question actually addresses that point. We've talked a lot about MPAs in Sri Lanka, but globally, how popular are marine protected areas as a conservation tool? I myself have seen, as I said at the start of this session, scientific papers that are potentially trying to limit or potentially reverse the decision to declare and gazette and officiate so many marine protected areas. Are there proven examples of how they benefit conservation, and what is their popularity actually, if you look at it practically?
Very popular across the world, and I think some of the best examples, I always allude to these examples from other developing countries because they're the best kind of comparison for Sri Lanka. We shouldn't look at our coral reef MPAs as compared to the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. You know, it's a very different social, cultural context. Management resources are different. We will never be similar to that. But developing countries like African countries, Asian countries, they've had very successful community managed MPAs or community collaborative managed MPAs where people benefit from these and have demonstrated benefits of increased fish catches as on top of tourism. And the community now in some of those countries, the community have community rangers to enforce it. The regulations. So they have mooring fees, for example, where dive boats use moorings instead of anchoring, and those funds go into community development. Even in the Maldives, the Bar Atoll Man and Biosphere Reserve, all the funds from the revenue generated from the ticket revenue, the part of that goes into a large fund that supports the local community through a community fund, improves local schools. So the community very much supports these MPAs, and they have increased certain, the populations of certain threatened species or the condition of critical ecosystems. But this ties back to what I said about research, baseline, and monitoring, because that is also important to demonstrate success, identify the problems, and adapt solutions. Because, like I said, if you have a baseline, we need to have monitoring. And then we know, are we achieving those targets? Is the reef improving? How do we say that fish catchers are improving without data? You're leaving it to personal perceptions or people's understanding. Someone will say, yes, fish catch has gone up. Someone will say, no, it hasn't. But data is data. You need to have this kind of data to look at how the condition of a reef or a fish population or even socioeconomic monitoring of people's income and revenue and all of that. That is important to demonstrate the success, and also where there are always failures. Nothing is perfect in any country. So where you have issues and problems, then we identify that the solution we are doing or some management action we are doing may not be working the way we want it to. And this data shows that we are not achieving it. Then we adapt it. Then we change it. Otherwise, what happens, and this is unfortunately has happened in Sri Lanka sometimes, is that we repeat the same process and we expect a different result. It's never going to happen. We have to adapt to this, but you need data.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Nishan. So scientific data is a backbone. And having said that, there does seem to be a lot of techniques and management strategies internationally that could potentially be implemented with the relevant data in place. Okay, so moving on then as we start coming towards the end of the session. Mr. Amararathna, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are very talked about these days. And SDG 14 in particular, life underwater, has a real context here. So SDG 14.5, target 14.5, states that countries are obliged to protect 10% of their ocean coverage or their territorial seas under some level of protection. So, and I appreciate that you as a government officer can only tell us so much. But is there anything you can tell us about what plans the DWC has to expand marine protected area coverage in Sri Lanka? What can you tell us?
Yeah, actually now we are in a process to increase our marine protected area network. Actually, recently we have declared so many protected areas. For example, after 2010, we declared so many marine protected areas. Very recently, we have declared Kayankani, as Nishan mentioned. Nishan also very much involved in this process, and also we declared great basses and little basses close to Yala National Park, and also we are in the process of declaring Mirissa area, actually a big area, Mirissa whale areas, and also in future we are working to with Nishan and other marine biologists to declare Thalavila Reef is close to Kalpidia Bar Reef. That is also very important coral reef, and also the dolphin and other marine mammal habitat. And also north of Vilpattu area, north to Battarangundu, north of Vilpattu area, we have identified as very
very important, very important dugong habitat. The seagrass beds of that area, the feeding grounds of dugongs, and those area also we plan to declare in future. I think if we declare those areas, we can achieve the SDG targets 14.5.
Okay, thank you. That's really good to hear, Mr. Amararathna, that the department is moving to, gazette, declare, and demarcate more marine protected areas. I think the whole point of this discussion today is that we are looking at a positive future for marine protected areas. So it is really, really good to hear that. So you touched upon great basses and little basses. Now that marine wildlife sanctuary was gazetted, I believe, in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, at the end of 2019, I think in October. So with regard to great basses and little basses as an MPA, it's now technically the largest marine protected area in Sri Lanka at 673 square kilometers. Can you tell us a bit more about the particular specifics as to why you declared, or why the DWC declared great basses and little basses as an MPA? Why was it done?
Yeah, actually, there are several reasons for declare that area. One thing is that area, there are several shipwrecks there, and very good marine habitat we can find that area, and also the very good whale habitat. Recently, we got some information, and there are several species of whales are using that water, and also several coral reefs also we can find that area. Those are the reason to declare that area as a sanctuary. Yes.
Okay, and now to the best of my understanding, great basses and little basses is also a managed fisheries area, or was at one point. Did you have any difficulties or any communication issues with the Department of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, or are both departments moving towards a more joint plan to manage that marine protected area? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we are planning to manage those areas jointly with the Fisheries Department and our department. I think we establish a committee in our department with the support of other agencies, other relevant agencies, scientists, and all stakeholders. Then it is easy to take decisions, and we can communicate, and we can do our job better way without having conflicts within other departments and other agencies.
Thank you, Mr. Amararathna. I think this is a key issue that we face in Sri Lanka with a bit of a fragmented institutional framework. But it is really good to see that there is going to be more cooperation between the multiple entities who are involved in marine protected areas. Going forward from that, Nishan. Now we talked again. We've had quite a discussion about marine protected areas today, but compared to the terrestrial protected area network in Sri Lanka, MPAs are still relatively small. Now, in your opinion, why is this? And do you see any ecological constraints that are causing this, and any potential solutions that we can take this forward to increase MPA coverage?
Yeah, I think good point. I think the Basses Sanctuary and the Bar Reef Marine Sanctuary are the two outliers because they are reasonably large. But you're correct that most MPAs are small, and many of them are very small. Usually sometimes a couple hundred hectares, which is very small. The challenge for this is Sri Lanka as an island nation has very high population density and high fishing pressure. So there isn't an inch of our ocean that isn't currently fished. So declaring areas as no-take areas or marine protected areas of any form is not easy. There's usually, we've already had these issues of Tibu and interdepartmental, conflict. So there's always this situation where there are other departments with mandates to support extractive uses, and the communities initially can object to things. So it's not easy to, just go ahead and declare. So the idea sometimes has been to look at very critical ecosystems. And if you look at, we are getting a little bit bigger MPAs now, and that's, I think, again, a positive thing. But initially, if you look at the MPAs that were originally declared, they were mostly around coral reefs, and they tend to just, capture one small individual reef. Now, this has problems because they don't capture all the ecological process. Some of the fish in that reef, use larger areas. They don't stay in the invisible boundaries that we create on maps. Some of the large fish move out of these sanctuaries and are vulnerable to fishing pressure. There are other pressures like sedimentation and pollution that happen outside that impact these places. And I talked about spillover and movement of species. So they're not good. And some fish species use different ecosystems at different stages of their life cycle. So, you need to protect the mangroves and the seagrasses, which are a nursery for some of the fish that you now find on a coral reef as adults. So you have to look at these large areas. Now, Bar Reef, for example, captures a wide variety of ecosystems. So it's good, but the small ones don't. So one solution for this, considering that sometimes in some areas it may not be feasible to declare large areas, is to declare networks of MPAs. Small MPAs that are fairly closely located, so that you have these little refuges and you create these refuges for animals and critical habitats. It's something they've done a lot in Southeast Asia, again, where they have these similar problems. You don't have many large MPAs. There are few, but most of the MPAs are quite small, similar to ours. Philippines has very small MPAs, so they've set up a network of MPAs. So that's some of the options you can look at for these. But definitely, these fragmented small MPAs are not viable. We need to look at large areas, but at least it's happening now, so it's good.
Okay, so there was that issue, but now I think there's potentially a more technical, comprehensive, scientific approach that is being taken towards MPAs.
I wouldn't go so far as saying that we've really completely nailed it, but let's say that the trend is moving in the right direction. We still face many challenges. I think those of us who are in the conservation research community, like myself, as well as in the government agencies like Mr. Amararathna, we are all very aware of the challenges and the realistic problems. I think we are also constrained by various things, but I think we can say that there is some positive traction towards better decision making.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So we have a steps to go. But now there are a lot of MPAs, and we talked a lot technically about fisheries, we talked about the ecotourism component, but there's another type of MPA, Mr. Amararathna, that you mentioned earlier, these proposed sea mammal observation zones. So I understand that the DWC has been trying to establish these, and from what I remember, a gazette was released with regulations, at least, that concern how fisheries sea mammal observation should be done. But in terms of actually declaring, demarcating, and gazetting these sea mammal observation zones, since they will be technically MPAs, what is that process? And beyond Trincomalee, Kalpiti, and Mirissa, are there any others that you will select?
Yeah, the Trincomalee, Kalpiti, and Mirissa are the main famous marine mammal observation areas. Actually, we gazetted marine mammal observation regulation few years back. I think now we are in the process to revise and update the marine mammal observation regulations, and we discuss with other parties, and we are in the process of revising those regulations, and we cannot declare all marine mammal observation areas, but as I mentioned earlier, we are in the process of declaring Mirissa area, but when we declare in Mirissa area, we are facing some problem because it's a very famous shipping route, and also it's a very good fishing. There are thousands of fishermen are doing their activities in that area. Therefore, we should have good discussion with other agencies, as I mentioned, and but I'm sure we can declare those areas as marine sanctuary in future. Yeah, but the regulation of marine mammal observation activities are very important, because we know in some boat operators, they behave, they make some impacts to whales and other marine mammals. Therefore, we should have close monitoring of their activities. In Mirissa area now, we are together with Coast Guard, and we are conducting monitoring. And for this activity, we purchase wave rider vessel also to monitoring activities. In Kalpitiya area also, we closely work with Sri Lanka Navy and Fisheries Department also, and we are conducting monitoring and regulation activities of marine mammal observation.
Thank you, Mr. Amararathna. So that's good to hear that there's again an attempt to properly collaborate with other government entities. And in the spirit of collaboration, I'll just go on to our final question for today. Is there any other central governing entity for marine protected areas in Sri Lanka aside from the DWC? And who should we contact even at the DWC, or who should the general public contact if they want to know more about marine protected areas? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, Department of Wildlife Conservation mainly responsible for marine protected area management, which were declared under the provision of Department of Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. And as Nishan mentioned, there are fishery management area they are declared by Fisheries Department, and they are governing those areas. Actually, as an initial step, we form a committee, as I mentioned, the support of all the organizations, scientists, and other stakeholders. Then I think we can do the management of fishery management areas very effectively and efficiently. I think that's very important, managing those areas.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Amararathna. Nishan, just before we wrap up, any final points on that, based on your work with these government entities?
Yeah, I think moving forward, we have to look at a combination of these. Both the Department of Wildlife Conservation and the Department of Fisheries have a role to play. I mean, the Department of Wildlife Conservation, I think, plays kind of the lead role in marine protected areas and in a traditional marine protected area concept, and particularly our national parks, marine national park sanctuaries, and no-take zones. But the Department of Fisheries has a big role to play, not just because of the fishery management areas, but for most of our marine protected areas, the single biggest human activity that causes problems is fishing. I mean, there are other problems, is pollution and upriver problems and sedimentation and all these things, but the single biggest problem is fishing, or overfishing and unsustainable fishing, destructive fishing. So it's important that you coordinate with that, because the wider fishery management objectives and actions impact the marine sanctuary. So if you are having, for example, in a district, very poor fishing practices and poorly managed fisheries, and you have FFPO declared MPA in isolation, it's going to be very difficult, because all those fishing units or fishermen outside are eventually going to try to come into this MPA and fish. And now the wildlife department has their hands full trying to manage this. So it's important that the overall fisheries management addresses things. And some of the most problematic fishery issues like bottom set fishing, dynamite fishing, those are actually prohibited fishing methods under the Fisheries Act. So enforcing the Fisheries Act as a whole, managing fisheries on the large scale, is going to support the wildlife department and the MPAs, not just the FMAs, but also the ones under the FFPO. So that's something we have to do. And there are some initiatives going forward to look at kind of combined approaches. BRT and DWC are working together on a new project that will hopefully start very soon, looking at both fishery managed areas and FFPO declared MPAs as they. So there is work, and the department is very active. Like we both mentioned, the unit is young, the marine unit is young, the process is young. So there are challenges, but with time, hopefully these capacity issues will get resolved, and I think we can. Let's hope for the future. I mean, we all work with these intentions in mind, and hopefully we can see better results in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nishan, and thank you, Mr. Amararathna. We have two questions before we wind down, so I'll split it one apiece. So starting with Mr. Amararathna, a member of the audience has asked, if aquaculture occurs within protected areas and what the legislation concerning aquaculture and protected areas is. Is it allowed? Is it not allowed? What can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, within protected areas, traditional fishing activities is are allowed, but that some kind of artificial that aquaculture activities are not permitted within protected area.
So what would be examples of the aquaculture activities that are not permitted in marine protected areas? Maybe one or two examples if you can give us?
For example, cage culture or other aquaculture activities are not permitted within the sanctuary, so within the marine protected area.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Amararathna. Nishan, the final question is for you. A member of the audience was asking, following the 2004 tsunami, the Coast Conservation and Coastal Resources Management Department, which, as we are aware, occupies that coastal transitional area between land and sea, and they introduced the concept of a 100-meter buffer zone, as well as a few sort of semi-marine protected area types like coastal reservations and affected areas, amongst others, including beach parks as well. What, to the best of your knowledge, is happening with those, and are those enforced with them?
I think with all regulations and provisions in Sri Lanka, enforcement is not always effective. There are plenty of examples of it being enforced. I know prosecutions have taken place through the Coast Conservation Department, but people will also point to very real examples where people have violated these things. I mean, it's the same thing with MPAs and FFPO. We can protect things, we have MPAs, but the reality is, of course, there is poaching inside our MPAs and destructive activities. It doesn't mean that the Wildlife Department never enforces. I was recently up in Kalpitia related to the Talavila proposed sanctuary, and the department had very recently, prosecuted several fishers. It was actually quite a significant event of prosecuting people for illegal fishing inside the MPA. So these things happen, they are enforcing, but you can always point to things where it's not happening as well. And there's certainly violations of the buffer zone concept.
Okay, and just for Mr. Amararathna, just for the purposes of clarity, does the DWC work with the Coast Conservation and Coastal Resources Management Department in any capacity? And if so, what is that work about, or does it not work with the Coast Conservation Department?
Sorry, Mr. Wilson, please elaborate your question.
Yeah, sorry. So I was asking, does the DWC work with the Coast Conservation Department much on projects? And if so, what are those projects? Or does it not work with them?
Yeah, actually, we are working closely with Coastal Conservation Department. For example, after the tsunami, there was a post-tsunami project in Eastern Coast. Actually, we together did much activities for the conservation, especially in Pigeon Island conservation activities, and also in Kumana Park turtle conservation activities. Actually, both departments have worked together in a lot of conservation activities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Amararathna. So, sadly, today we have come to the end of what has been a very detailed and a very, very interesting session on marine conservation and marine protected area expansion in the future. So, since it's time to conclude today's session, I would like to start by thanking our exclusive patron, the delegation of the European Union in Sri Lanka and the Maldives, the summit patron, Dilma Conservation, along with the supporting patron, Keels and Plaster Circle. I truly hope that everybody who tuned in today enjoyed and learned more about marine conservation and marine protected area expansion. Thank you to both of you, Mr. Amararathna and to Nishan, for joining in for today's session. It was a real pleasure having the both of you here. So thank you very much once again. Tomorrow's first session commences at 10 a.m. and is on the topic of ocean pollution under the theme of ocean pollution and solutions. So do stay tuned and join us tomorrow as we continue with the World Ocean Day Summit. Once again, happy World Environmental Day to everybody, and I wish all of you, as well as our two expert panelists, a lovely rest of the evening. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Nishan. Thank you, Mr. Amararathna.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.